The morning began like any other, with the sun rising lazily over the small town where the protagonist lived. Life there was simple and predictable, a rhythm of routines that people had followed for generations. But that calmness was about to be shattered. The protagonist was known in the town as someone who spoke boldly and acted decisively. People admired the courage, but some also feared the impulsiveness that often came with it. It started with an idea, a daring plan that the protagonist thought would change everything. The plan was meant to prove strength, intelligence, and leadership. On paper, it seemed perfect. It promised recognition and respect, and more than that, it promised to shake the world in ways no one had expected. But there was a problem. In the excitement of ambition, the protagonist overlooked one critical fact. The plan was going to clash with a group far stronger, far wiser, and far more resilient than anyone in the town had ever faced. At first, the idea was discussed quietly among close allies. The protagonist explained it with passion, using strong words that painted pictures of glory and victory. The team nodded along, trusting the confidence in the voice of their leader. No one wanted to question the plan too much. There was a kind of excitement in believing that they could challenge anyone, even those considered untouchable. But there were small warnings, almost whispers that something was being underestimated. The protagonist waved them off, convinced that courage and quick thinking were all that was needed to succeed. Once the plan was set into motion, it began to affect the town immediately. Signs appeared that the world outside was noticing. Messages, rumors, and subtle reactions hinted that the opponent was aware of the challenge. But the protagonist, caught in the thrill of action, treated these signs as minor inconveniences. "They will see reason," was often said, as if people could simply explain away the consequences of challenging a powerful group. Life in the town continued around the unfolding plan, but attention was slowly building. The protagonist went about daily routines with determination, unaware of how much attention they had drawn. Every action, every decision, every word seemed to ripple outward. Small conflicts began to appear, mostly in subtle forms. A shipment delayed here, a miscommunication there. Nothing overt, nothing threatening, but enough to unsettle those paying close attention. At the same time, the protagonist's allies remained loyal. Some were friends from childhood, some had grown close through shared experiences, and some simply believed in the promise of adventure. They worked tirelessly to support the plan, often underestimating the risks because they trusted the one leading them. The protagonist appreciated their loyalty, but was too caught up in ambition to notice the cracks forming beneath the surface. One day, the first clear warning came in a way that could not be ignored. A messenger arrived with a note, unsigned but unmistakably from the other group. The words were simple, almost casual, yet they carried weight. "You are treading a dangerous path." The town council tried to intervene, urging caution and suggesting that diplomacy might prevent unnecessary conflict. But the protagonist was stubborn. The thrill of challenge outweighed the risk, and the warning was dismissed as nothing more than a bluff. This was the moment when the protagonist truly began to underestimate the situation. There was a sense of invincibility, a belief that the right combination of courage, cleverness, and determination could overcome anything. In conversations with allies, phrases like "they will not fight us" or "we are smarter than they think" were repeated. The protagonist saw the world as a game of strategy, where a single bold move could change everything. What they did not see was the depth of experience, history, and resilience behind the group they were challenging. Days turned into weeks, and small events began to accumulate. Shops reported unusual behavior, travel routes showed signs of observation, and conversations overheard hinted at growing awareness. The protagonist noticed these things but framed them as challenges to be overcome rather than warnings. The town itself became a stage for a drama that was slowly building. People started feeling a mixture of excitement and anxiety. There were those who admired the courage, and those who feared the consequences. During this period, the protagonist also faced personal moments of doubt. Alone at night, looking out over the quiet streets, fleeting thoughts of, "What if we fail?" crossed the mind, but these thoughts were quickly pushed aside. Confidence, after all, had always been a companion. It had carried the protagonist through past challenges, and it seemed natural to rely on it again. Allies noticed these moments but rarely spoke of them, because to question the plan now felt like betraying it. An unexpected visitor one evening brought a fresh perspective. An elder from a nearby community, known for wisdom and experience, came quietly to speak. They told stories of past conflicts, of groups that had faced similar challenges and underestimated opponents, only to regret it later. The elder's words were measured, calm, and clear. "The wrong move now can change everything," they said. But again, the protagonist smiled politely, nodding yet feeling that the words were unnecessary caution. The elder left quietly, leaving a lingering sense of unease, but it was ignored. Meanwhile, the other group, the one that had been underestimated, was already taking note of every move. They did not react loudly or aggressively at first. Instead, they observed, planned, and waited. Their history was one of patience, strategy, and resilience. They understood the rhythms of human behavior and the dangers of rash decisions. From their perspective, the actions of the protagonist and the town were almost predictable, each misstep carefully noted. In the town, life carried on, but small changes began to hint at the upcoming storm. News from neighboring regions spoke of strange alliances forming, rumors of strategic movements and subtle disruptions that were easy to dismiss. The protagonist's team continued to prepare, working tirelessly to implement the plan. There was a sense of pride, a belief that they were shaping history. Yet beneath that pride, tiny fractures were forming, frustrations over minor failures, disagreements on methods, and the quiet fear that perhaps the world outside was not as simple as they had imagined. One morning, a particularly unusual event occurred. A shipment critical to the plan was delayed, not due to incompetence but because of a careful, invisible obstruction. At first, no one realized what had happened, but as patterns emerged over the following days, the reality became harder to ignore. Someone or something was responding. Yet in the protagonist's mind, it was still a minor inconvenience, a challenge that cleverness and persistence could overcome. This phase, perhaps the most dangerous, was filled with a mix of tension and excitement. People felt the thrill of anticipation, believing they were part of something larger than themselves. Stories of past heroes were shared, lessons from history were selectively remembered, and the town buzzed with a sense of importance. Everyone wanted to believe in victory, and no one wanted to think too much about what might happen if they were wrong. By now, the protagonist had become a figure of inspiration to some and concern to others. Their charisma, decisiveness, and courage were undeniable. Allies continued to follow, even as subtle signs of risk grew. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first real confrontation. It was a delicate balance, one that would soon be disrupted by forces far greater than anyone had imagined. As Part 1 closes, the stage is fully set. The protagonist has acted boldly, perhaps too boldly, and has begun a path that cannot easily be reversed. The wrong civilization is watching silently, waiting for the moment to respond. The calm before the storm is deceptive. The quiet streets of the town hide a tension that grows with every passing day. The excitement, pride, and ambition of the protagonist have set in motion a story that will test courage, patience, and intelligence in ways no one could have predicted. And so, the first chapter ends not with a victory, but with the spark of a conflict that promises to change everything. The protagonist stands on the edge of history, unaware of just how dangerous the path has become, and how much they will need to grow in order to survive what is coming. The days after the first warning passed slowly, yet every moment seemed heavier than the last. The town, once peaceful and predictable, now carried a tension that could not be ignored. People moved with caution. Whispers floated through streets and marketplaces, and every small action seemed to ripple outward. The protagonist, however, remained confident. There was a sense of pride in believing that their plan would succeed. The courage and cleverness could overcome any obstacle. At first, the signs of the opponent's presence were subtle, almost imperceptible. A shipment arrived later than expected. Communication lines were disrupted, or minor conflicts arose between allies. To outsiders, these might have seemed like simple mistakes or coincidences. But the protagonist noticed them, or at least thought they noticed. Each small setback was explained away as a trivial problem, a test that could be solved with quick thinking and determination. The words, "It's fine, we can handle this," were repeated often, almost like a mantra to silence doubt. This overconfidence began to shape the behavior of the town. Allies worked harder, believing in the promise of success, while others, more cautious, began to distance themselves quietly. Some whispered among themselves, warning that perhaps the opponent was not as weak as the protagonist believed. Yet those whispers were small and almost ignored, overshadowed by the excitement of the plan and the belief that bold action always brought reward. The first mistake came not from inexperience, but from arrogance. The protagonist decided to push forward aggressively, announcing plans publicly, showing the world that their group would not back down. It was a decision made with the intention of inspiring confidence, but instead, it revealed strategy and ambition to the opponent. What had been quiet observation became an opportunity. The other group, experienced and patient, began to respond in ways that were deliberate and carefully measured. Every move was calculated to test, provoke, and expose weaknesses without showing strength too early. Meanwhile, inside the town, the protagonist continued to celebrate small victories. Minor successes were exaggerated, and every tiny achievement became proof that the plan was working. Allies nodded, cheered, and praised, reinforcing the sense of invincibility. It was easy to feel untouchable when surrounded by approval and encouragement. But beneath the surface, small cracks were forming. Doubts, even if unspoken, began to grow. Some allies started questioning timing, logistics, or even the wisdom of certain actions. They feared consequences, yet no one dared speak too loudly, afraid of being labeled as fearful or unfaithful. The opponent's response, though quiet at first, became clearer as time went on. A shipment that should have arrived smoothly was delayed, with no explanation. A key piece of communication went missing, leaving confusion and frustration in its place. Minor conflicts that seemed isolated now formed a pattern. Every misstep by the protagonist's team, no matter how careful they thought they were, was quietly noted and exploited. The opponent didn't attack directly yet. They observed, waited, and subtly guided the situation to their advantage. Inside the town, the protagonist noticed these disruptions but remained convinced they were minor problems, easily fixed. Confidence, bordering on arrogance, prevented any serious reconsideration of strategy. Instead of pausing to study the opponent, the protagonist doubled down. Plans were revised to be more aggressive, actions were made more public, and efforts were put into proving strength rather than understanding the full scope of the challenge. It was a dangerous mix of pride and excitement, a combination that blinded even the most careful observers. People in the town began to feel the pressure. Not everyone shared the protagonist's confidence. Some allies started to see the warning signs and tried to suggest caution, hinting at the opponent's patience and skill. Their warnings were met with polite nods, but rarely with serious attention. The protagonist, accustomed to being admired and followed, struggled to accept the idea that others might see danger where they saw only opportunity. Then came the first public display of the opponent's skill. It was small, almost understated, but impossible to ignore. A delivery that had been promised to the town arrived incomplete, with vital pieces missing. Messages went unanswered or arrived altered in subtle ways. At first it seemed like miscommunication or error, but the pattern became undeniable. Someone outside the town was watching, planning, and acting with precision. This was not chaos. It was strategy. The protagonist faced this reality with a mix of disbelief and pride. There was a tendency to minimize the threat, to frame every sign of trouble as a challenge to overcome, as proof that they were capable. The words "they will not stop us" were repeated frequently, almost like a shield against reality. Allies, seeing the stubborn confidence, continued to follow without protest, even when doubts surfaced in their hearts. Inside this growing tension, life continued. The town's daily rhythms masked the silent preparation for what was to come. Markets remained busy, children played, and people went about their chores. Yet under this ordinary exterior, a quiet nervousness spread. Stories were shared of unusual events elsewhere, reports of strange alliances forming and hints of unusual intelligence gathering. Each report was discussed quietly, sometimes ignored, sometimes worried over, but always filtered through the lens of the protagonist's optimism. The sense of invincibility reached a turning point during a meeting with the closest advisors. The protagonist, brimming with energy and excitement, laid out an aggressive expansion of the plan. Every detail was explained with confidence, every risk minimized. Advisors listened, some nodding, some exchanging quiet glances, but none openly challenging the vision. The protagonist believed that boldness alone could achieve success. What they did not see was that each step was becoming more visible, more predictable, and more vulnerable. A few individuals in the town began to sense that something had changed. Subtle feelings of unease, quiet fears about overconfidence, and the growing realization that the opponent was more capable than anyone had believed began to surface. Yet these voices remained quiet, overshadowed by the excitement and momentum of action. The protagonist's charisma and confidence created a gravitational pull. It was easier to believe in victory than to question strategy. Meanwhile, the opponent's moves became more deliberate. They did not strike directly but used careful, invisible methods to test the town's response. Supplies were rerouted, messages delayed, and minor disruptions multiplied. The protagonist's team focused on proving strength, struggled to connect the dots. Every small setback was treated as temporary, every challenge an opportunity for heroism, every problem a chance to demonstrate skill. This period of underestimation would prove critical. The protagonist's belief in superiority blinded them to the resilience and strategy of the opponent. Confidence became a double-edged sword. It inspired loyalty, courage, and determination, but it also created blind spots that could not be ignored. Allies continued to support the vision, motivated by trust and admiration, while the opponent quietly watched, waited, and planned. By the end of this phase, the town had become a mix of energy, excitement, and nervousness. The protagonist, convinced of inevitable success, pushed forward without fully realizing the strength of the forces arrayed against them. Subtle warnings were ignored. Lessons from the past were forgotten, and human instincts were overridden by ambition and pride. And so, Part 2 closes with the stage set for the first real confrontation. The opponent, patient and strategic, has begun to reveal their skill, exploiting small missteps and testing the protagonist's responses. The town, still caught up in optimism and confidence, is moving toward a conflict far greater than anyone had imagined. Underestimation has become the greatest risk, and the first blow is only a matter of time. The excitement and pride that carried the protagonist thus far may soon collide with reality in ways that will test courage, patience, and intelligence like never before. The calm that had lasted for weeks was finally shattered in the quietest of ways. The first real blow came not with shouting or fanfare, but in a simple, almost invisible act that rippled outward and changed everything. A shipment critical to the town's plan, carefully prepared over weeks, disappeared. Not stolen in plain sight, not sabotaged openly, simply gone. At first, the disappearance was dismissed as a mistake, someone misplacing it or a delay caused by bad timing. But as hours passed and explanations failed to appear, it became clear. Someone had acted against them deliberately and with skill. The protagonist received the news with disbelief. The first instinct was to deny the reality, to believe it was a simple error that could be fixed. "We can still recover," they said, repeating the phrase as though saying it enough times could make it true. Allies rushed to investigate, their energy and determination shining even in uncertainty. They scoured records, checked routes, questioned those involved, but every lead ended in frustration. Every path seemed carefully closed, as if the opponent had anticipated every move before it even happened. For the first time, the protagonist felt a real sense of fear. Not the kind that paralyzes, but a sharp, gnawing awareness that the opponent was smarter, faster, and more organized than anyone had imagined. The town, once full of confidence and energy, now seemed fragile. People whispered in corners, exchanged nervous glances, and hesitated before speaking. The excitement that had carried them through bold decisions was now mingled with doubt. The opponent's actions, subtle as they were, carried a clear message. Underestimation would no longer be tolerated. It was not a direct attack, but a demonstration of control. The missing shipment, the delays, the small confusions, they were all carefully orchestrated to test the town, to expose weaknesses, and to challenge the confidence that had carried the protagonist this far. Every reaction, every frantic effort to fix the problem, played into the opponent's hands. Inside the town, tension rose quickly. The protagonist tried to remain calm, speaking to allies with the same tone of confidence, but the cracks in the facade were visible. Doubt had entered the room, subtle but undeniable. The excitement of previous days was replaced by careful calculation, questions, and second-guessing. Allies who had always followed faithfully began to hesitate, though few spoke openly. Fear, quiet but persistent, began to creep into conversations, meetings, and planning sessions. The first blow did more than disrupt a shipment. It disrupted trust. The protagonist began to question whether their strategies were too simple, too obvious. Every step that had once felt bold and clever now seemed risky and exposed. In quiet moments, sitting alone and reviewing plans, the realization settled in. The opponent was not reacting hastily. They were planning, anticipating, and responding with precision. This was no ordinary challenge. It was a carefully crafted test of intelligence, patience, and resilience. The day wore on, and the impact of the blow became clearer. Delays in preparation caused minor conflicts among allies. Frustrations rose, and the once seamless teamwork began to falter. Small mistakes that would have been forgiven before were now magnified under pressure. The protagonist's voice, once confident and inspiring, had to carry both reassurance and strategy, balancing hope with the harsh truth that the town was now vulnerable. At the same time, the opponent continued their quiet campaign. Another message arrived, this time visible and deliberate, though not openly aggressive. It was a statement of awareness, a signal that every move was being watched. The words were simple, almost casual, yet carried the weight of experience and warning. Every choice has consequences. Every action is noted. The town council urged caution, suggesting that perhaps the time for bold displays had passed. But the protagonist, though shaken, was not ready to back down. Courage and pride were still guiding the decisions, even as fear began to mix with determination. This first real confrontation forced everyone to adapt. Allies worked longer hours, double-checking every detail, questioning every assumption. The protagonist began to see the value in listening more carefully, weighing each decision before acting. Confidence alone could no longer carry them. Every step required strategy, patience, and careful observation. The lessons that had been ignored in the excitement of ambition were now unavoidable. Despite the fear and tension, there were moments of humanity shining through. Allies comforted each other after long, stressful days, sharing quiet jokes to ease nerves. Meals were prepared together, small acts of care reminding everyone why they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. Even as the opponent's actions caused frustration and fear, these human connections became a source of strength, grounding the town in the knowledge that courage alone was not enough. It needed loyalty, cooperation, and care. The protagonist also faced personal struggles. Alone at night, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily. The thought that one mistake could undo weeks of preparation or risk the town's safety was overwhelming. Yet amid fear and uncertainty, determination remained. The protagonist reflected on past experiences, drawing lessons from failures and successes alike. Courage had brought them this far, but intelligence and patience would be required to survive the next steps. The first blow had changed the rules of engagement. No longer could the town act boldly without thought. Every decision needed scrutiny. Every plan required contingency. Every action had to anticipate the opponent's response. The energy of previous days was replaced with focus and caution. The lesson was clear. Underestimating the wrong civilization came at a cost, and that cost had just been revealed. As the town adapted, the opponent remained patient, observing and testing. No direct attacks had been made yet, but the message was unmistakable. Strength alone would not ensure victory. Subtle control, strategic planning, and careful observation were far more powerful than bold action or impulsive decisions. Every reaction from the protagonist and allies provided insight into weaknesses, tendencies, and vulnerabilities. The opponent used these lessons to shape their next moves, always one step ahead. The town, despite its setbacks, began to learn. Mistakes were analyzed, strategies were revised, and the importance of humility became clearer. The protagonist, though shaken, began to value observation as much as action. Allies who had quietly doubted were now more involved in planning, their voices welcomed and considered. Courage alone was no longer enough. Survival depended on intelligence, cooperation, and respect for the opponent's skill. Even in the face of adversity, hope persisted. The town had not been defeated. They had faced the first blow, learned from it, and adapted. Human resilience, loyalty, and care became their greatest assets. The first confrontation, while painful, revealed not just the opponent's strength, but also the capacity of the town to grow, adjust, and endure. By the end of this phase, the stage was set for the next steps in the conflict. The protagonist and allies had survived their first test, but the cost had been clear. Pride had been tempered, confidence had been challenged, and courage alone would no longer suffice. The opponent's skill, patience, and strategy had been demonstrated, leaving the town with a clear understanding of the stakes. Every move from now on would require care, intelligence, and respect for a civilization that had already proven its power. And so, Part 3 ends with the first real blow having struck, shaking confidence and testing courage. The protagonist has begun to understand the depth of the challenge, and the town is forced to adapt in ways they had never imagined. Fear, determination, and human resilience now coexist, preparing the stage for a conflict that will demand more than bravery. It will demand wisdom, patience, and a willingness to learn from every step. After the first real blow, the town seemed different. The streets still held life, and people still went about their daily tasks, but the energy had changed. Conversations carried a quiet tension, and every decision, no matter how small, was weighed carefully. The excitement of the past had been replaced by cautious determination. Yet, despite fear and uncertainty, the town continued to move forward, knowing that stopping or retreating was not an option. The protagonist, once brimming with unshakable confidence, now found themselves in a new role. Leadership had shifted from bold declarations to careful planning. Every action had to be considered, every plan scrutinized. The first blow had taught a harsh lesson. Courage alone could no longer guarantee success. Now intelligence, patience, and careful observation had to guide every decision. Allies began to notice the change in demeanor. Confidence was tempered by reflection, pride replaced with careful humility. Even with this new approach, the challenges kept coming. The opponent, silent but always present, escalated their strategies. Small disruptions grew into more significant obstacles. Routes that were once reliable became unpredictable. Communication that had been smooth now faced delays, interference, or misdirection. At first, the protagonist and their allies treated these issues as annoyances, manageable inconveniences. But over time, patterns emerged. Each disruption revealed not only the opponent's skill but also the limits of the town's previous planning. Inside the town, tensions began to rise among the allies. Frustrations, small disagreements, and clashing opinions started surfacing. Some argued for more aggressive action, believing that boldness could turn the tide. Others suggested restraint, warning that every misstep could be fatal. Meetings, once straightforward, became filled with debate and negotiation. The protagonist had to navigate these tensions carefully, balancing morale with strategy. Leadership required listening as much as directing, patience as much as decisiveness. The escalation was not only external. Internally, the town faced human challenges that tested bonds and relationships. Fear, fatigue, and doubt weighed heavily on people. Allies who had once followed without question now questioned plans quietly in corners, discussing what-ifs in hushed voices. Small mistakes became magnified under the pressure, creating tension that was as much a threat as the opponent itself. The protagonist had to find ways to keep trust intact while confronting growing internal uncertainty. One day, a particularly challenging situation arose. A critical task, central to the plan's success, was at risk of failure due to a subtle interference. Supplies needed to reach a certain location but were delayed repeatedly. Messages that were crucial for coordination were lost or altered. Panic began to spread among the team. Small disagreements turned into arguments, and for the first time the protagonist's calm and collected exterior was tested. Every ally looked to them for guidance, reassurance, and solutions, expecting wisdom and confidence in equal measure. The protagonist realized that the town's survival depended not only on responding to the opponent, but also on maintaining internal cohesion. Leadership required empathy and understanding, patience and flexibility. It was not enough to plan and act. They had to observe, listen, and adapt. Allies were reminded that the greatest strength in facing a challenge was human connection, trust, loyalty, and shared purpose. Even as fear threatened to divide them, small acts of kindness, encouragement, and support helped keep the team united. Meanwhile, the opponent continued their quiet campaign. Every move was calculated, every action designed to test, provoke, and observe. They did not attack openly, yet the impact of their strategies grew steadily. Delays, miscommunications, and disruptions became more complex, requiring careful attention to detail and creative solutions. The protagonist and their allies had to think several steps ahead, anticipating not just what might happen next, but what the opponent wanted them to think would happen. It became a mental game as much as a physical one, a battle of wits that challenged every assumption. In this period, the town learned to adapt in ways they had not before. Mistakes became lessons rather than failures. Small victories, such as successfully completing a disrupted task or overcoming a sudden obstacle, were celebrated. Allies who had doubted the plan began to contribute ideas, their voices now valued for perspective and experience. The protagonist, once focused mainly on action, now emphasized observation, analysis, and strategy. Every day became a careful balance of risk and reward, courage and caution. Human moments continued to shine amidst the tension. Allies shared meals together, checked on each other after long, stressful days, and offered comfort when fear or doubt became overwhelming. Stories were told around fires or quiet corners, not just of the challenges they faced, but of resilience, humor, and past experiences that reminded them of strength. These moments of connection, though small, became the glue holding the town together. They reinforced the idea that courage alone could not sustain them. It was the human bonds, trust, and loyalty that would see them through. The protagonist faced personal challenges as well. Late at night, they reflected on the first blow and the ongoing escalation. The lessons of pride, overconfidence, and underestimation weighed heavily on their mind. Yet these reflections brought insight. They realized that true leadership was not about proving strength, but about guiding others through uncertainty, helping people adapt, and learning from every mistake. Courage had brought them this far, but wisdom and empathy would be required to navigate the days ahead. As days turned into weeks, the opponent's presence became increasingly evident. While direct attacks had not yet come, the disruptions and challenges made clear that patience, strategy, and planning were at play. The town had no illusions left about the strength and skill of their opponent. Every decision now carried weight. Every step required analysis, foresight, and teamwork. The town had grown, learning resilience, adaptability, and the value of listening as much as acting. Amidst this growing tension, the protagonist and allies found ways to turn adversity into strength. They developed contingency plans, anticipated possible disruptions, and tested multiple solutions before committing to action. The town's operations became more sophisticated, its coordination more precise. Mistakes were still made, but each one was quickly corrected and analyzed for lessons learned. The first blow had been painful, but it had taught the town a critical lesson. Underestimation could be fatal, and adaptation was essential. Allies began to appreciate the opponent's skill even more. The subtlety, patience, and strategy demonstrated were both intimidating and instructive. The town realized that respecting the strength of an opponent was not a sign of weakness, but a path to growth. Every challenge became an opportunity to learn, every disruption a chance to improve. Human resilience, creativity, and collaboration became the true weapons in the town's fight for survival. By the end of this phase, the town had transformed. Fear and doubt had not disappeared, but they were tempered by experience and adaptation. The protagonist had grown as a leader, balancing courage with wisdom, pride with humility, and ambition with caution. Allies had learned the importance of trust, cooperation, and observation. The first blow had been devastating, but it had also been the catalyst for growth, teaching the town lessons that would carry them through even greater challenges ahead. Part 4 ends with the conflict escalating further, alliances tested and the stakes growing higher. The town has survived the early disruptions but understands that the road ahead will demand intelligence, patience, and resilience. The opponent remains patient, strategic, and formidable. Every decision, every action, and every human connection will now shape the unfolding struggle. Courage alone is no longer enough. Now adaptability, insight, and unity will determine who survives and who falls. The turning point came quietly, almost unexpectedly, like a shadow stretching across the town. The protagonist had faced disruptions, delays, and small defeats before, but nothing compared to what was about to happen. It began with a series of mistakes that could no longer be blamed on chance. A critical plan, one that had taken weeks to prepare, failed not because of lack of effort, but because the opponent had anticipated every step. The failure was complete and visible, affecting not just the protagonist's team but the town itself. For the first time, the protagonist felt the weight of responsibility in a new and overwhelming way. Fear had been present before, subtle and sharp, but now it pressed on every decision, every thought. The reality was undeniable. Underestimating the opponent had led them here, and survival depended on learning from this mistake quickly. Allies looked to the protagonist for guidance, reassurance, and answers, even as their own frustration and doubt grew. The energy of confidence that had carried them so far was replaced by the heavy need for reflection, strategy, and adaptation. The town itself felt the impact of the failure. Supplies that had been carefully stockpiled were lost or delayed. Communication that had been relied on for coordination broke down under pressure. Simple tasks that once seemed easy became difficult, and small mistakes spiraled into larger problems. The human side of the story became evident. People were tired, stressed, and afraid, yet they continued to work, motivated by loyalty, hope, and the understanding that retreat was not an option. Courage alone could no longer carry them. They needed skill, patience, and wisdom. In the midst of this, the protagonist began to change. Pride and arrogance, which had once fueled bold decisions, were replaced by humility and careful observation. They began to study the opponent, not to confront them blindly, but to understand them. Every move, every reaction, every small disruption was examined for lessons. The protagonist realized that the opponent's strength did not come from brute force alone. It came from patience, strategy, and an understanding of human behavior. Learning to see through their eyes became crucial. Allies noticed the shift in leadership. Decisions were no longer made impulsively or in isolation. Planning became collaborative, with input from those who had previously hesitated to speak. Mistakes were discussed openly and lessons were applied immediately. The town began to see that failure, while painful, was a teacher. Every disruption, every obstacle, every setback became an opportunity to grow, adapt, and strengthen both strategy and morale. The human side of the conflict became more visible as well. Allies supported one another in small ways, sharing food, checking in on health, offering encouragement during long nights of planning. Families worried quietly, yet they provided emotional support, reminding everyone why they were fighting. Moments of humor, shared stories, and quiet reflection became lifelines in the midst of tension. These acts of human connection reminded everyone that resilience was not just about courage. It was about loyalty, empathy, and shared purpose. The turning point was also personal. The protagonist faced moments of self-doubt that had never existed before. Questions emerged that could not be ignored. Had they misjudged the opponent entirely? Were they capable of guiding the town through the growing challenges? Could the mistakes of the past weeks be corrected before permanent damage was done? These reflections were difficult, even painful, but they were necessary. The protagonist realized that leadership was more than boldness. It was about learning, adapting, and guiding others through uncertainty. As the town adjusted to the new reality, the opponent continued their quiet influence. Their strategies, subtle yet effective, forced the protagonist to rethink approaches at every level. Delays and disruptions were no longer random. They were signals, lessons, and tests. Every reaction from the town provided insight to the opponent, just as every observation of the opponent taught the town. A pattern of respect began to form in the mind of the protagonist. The opponent was not merely an obstacle, they were a teacher, challenging the town to grow beyond what it had imagined possible. The town began to implement new strategies. Contingency plans were developed for every task, communication lines were strengthened, and critical operations were checked and double-checked. Every member of the team was encouraged to speak, contribute ideas, and question assumptions. This collaboration not only strengthened plans but also improved morale. People began to feel a renewed sense of purpose, even in the face of ongoing challenges. They realized that while the opponent was powerful, human resilience, cooperation, and creativity could level the playing field. The protagonist also learned to value patience as much as action. Impulsiveness, once a strength, had become a liability. Now careful observation, slow planning, and timing became the tools for survival. The turning point had taught them that courage without wisdom could lead to disaster, but courage paired with understanding, humility, and strategy could achieve remarkable results. This was a lesson learned not from theory or advice, but from experience, failure, and careful reflection. Amidst these changes, human stories continued to emerge. Allies supported one another through fear, exhaustion, and moments of despair. Individuals discovered new strengths in themselves, whether in problem-solving, leadership, or simply in maintaining morale. The town, once fragmented by fear and frustration, began to unify in purpose and determination. The human capacity to adapt, support, and persevere became the true backbone of resilience. The protagonist's personal growth also reflected broader lessons for the town. They began to mentor allies not through commands or declarations, but through observation, guidance, and encouragement. Mistakes were treated as opportunities, not punishments. Creativity and flexibility were encouraged even under pressure. The opponent, though unseen directly, had inspired a new level of intelligence and strategic thinking. The turning point had shifted the approach from reactive to proactive, from impulsive to thoughtful, from pride to respect. At the same time, the stakes remained high. The opponent continued to challenge the town, testing responses and observing every action. The protagonist knew that survival would not be easy and that every decision mattered. Yet the turning point had given them a new perspective. The town was no longer blindly following courage. It was guided by wisdom, observation, and human connection. This balance of strength and strategy became the key to enduring the ongoing challenges. By the end of this phase, the protagonist and the town had transformed. The turning point had forced a deep reflection on mistakes, strategy, and human resilience. Allies had grown stronger, more capable, and more united. The human side of the story, the empathy, support, and loyalty, had become as important as the tactical side. The opponent remained formidable, patient, and strategic, but the town had learned to respect, adapt, and anticipate. Every lesson learned from failure strengthened their capacity to face what lay ahead. Part 5 closes with hope, reflection, and growth. The protagonist had faced the consequences of underestimation, but in doing so had gained wisdom and insight. The town had survived a critical test, learning the value of patience, strategy, and human connection. Courage alone would never have been enough, but the combination of human resilience, observation, and adaptability had prepared them for the next stage of the challenge. The turning point had been reached, and the town now stood ready to confront the opponent with a new understanding, stronger and wiser than before. The town had been through weeks of tension, setbacks, and lessons that were both painful and illuminating. By now, the protagonist and their allies had learned what courage alone could not teach: patience, observation, strategy, and above all, human connection. They had faced disruptions, delays, and calculated challenges from an opponent they had once underestimated. Every step had tested not only their abilities but also their resilience, loyalty, and unity. Now, as the story reached its final chapter, reflection and resolution became as important as action. The first thing the protagonist realized was that the town had grown stronger, not because of victories or bold moves, but because of adaptability. Mistakes had been made, plans had failed, and pride had been bruised. But every failure had taught a lesson. The human capacity to learn, to care for one another, and to adjust strategies in the face of difficulty had become their greatest strength. The protagonist saw allies differently now, appreciating not just their loyalty but their creativity, patience, and courage under pressure. The opponent, though powerful and strategic, had indirectly contributed to this growth. By testing the town in subtle ways, forcing mistakes, and challenging assumptions, they had revealed weaknesses and strengths alike. The protagonist had come to respect their skill, patience, and intelligence. This respect did not mean surrender or defeat. Rather, it was a recognition of the truth that strength and wisdom could not be ignored. To survive, the town had to understand and learn from the opponent, not simply confront them blindly. As the final phase of the conflict unfolded, the town shifted its approach. Operations were no longer reactive but carefully planned, with contingencies for every possibility. Allies communicated openly, sharing insights and suggestions that had previously gone unheard. The protagonist encouraged collaboration, valuing perspective as much as action. Each decision was measured, deliberate, and informed by lessons learned from past mistakes. The town had evolved from a group driven by ambition and excitement into a community guided by intelligence, care, and mutual respect. Human moments continued to define the story. Even amidst the tension, Allies found ways to support one another. Meals were shared, jokes whispered to ease fear, and small acts of kindness reminded everyone of the importance of connection. Families, though anxious, offered quiet encouragement, showing that courage could also come from those who stood behind the front lines. These moments strengthened morale and reminded everyone that their fight was about more than strategy. It was about human survival, dignity, and unity. The protagonist also faced personal growth. Pride had been replaced by humility, impulsiveness by careful thought, and the desire to prove strength by the need to protect and guide. They had learned to listen as much as they spoke, to value wisdom over bravado, and to recognize that leadership was not about being fearless, but about helping others find courage when fear was present. Every failure, every disruption, and every challenge had been a lesson in patience, strategy, and empathy. In the final stages of the conflict, the opponent made their presence known in ways that were more direct yet still strategic. Attempts were made to disrupt critical operations, and unexpected challenges arose that tested the town's coordination. Yet this time the town responded differently. Plans were adjusted quickly, communication was clear, and human resilience showed itself in full force. Allies worked together seamlessly, anticipating problems before they escalated and supporting one another when stress threatened to overwhelm. The protagonist guided them with a calm, confident, and wise presence, learned from weeks of trial and error. One of the most important realizations during this period was the value of respect for both allies and opponents. The town had learned that underestimating anyone, including themselves, could have consequences. Equally, overconfidence in strength or skill without careful thought was dangerous. The protagonist emphasized respect in every decision, fostering trust within the team and recognizing the intelligence of the opponent without fear or submission. This balance of respect, humility, and strategy became the cornerstone of the town's approach. The final days were not marked by dramatic battles or dramatic confrontations. Instead, they were defined by careful observation, precise action, and human collaboration. Every move was calculated, every response thoughtful, and every interaction considered. The town had transformed into a resilient, intelligent, and cohesive unit. The excitement and bravado of the early days had been replaced by a quiet confidence rooted in knowledge, patience, and connection. Human resilience had proven stronger than reckless courage. The protagonist also reflected on personal lessons. The journey had taught them that true leadership was not about winning or proving oneself, but about guiding, supporting, and learning alongside others. Mistakes were opportunities for growth. Fear was a teacher rather than a weakness, and every challenge carried a lesson. This understanding allowed them to make decisions with clarity, empathy, and strategic insight. They had grown not just as a leader but as a person, capable of seeing beyond immediate success and failure to the broader lessons of human resilience and collaboration. As the story neared its conclusion, the town reached a stage of equilibrium. The opponent, recognizing the growth, resilience, and intelligence of the town, ceased subtle disruptions and seemed to allow the community to stabilize. There was no dramatic victory or defeat, only the realization that underestimation had been costly, adaptation had been essential, and human strength, connection, and learning had made survival possible. The conflict had ended, not with conquest or destruction, but with respect, understanding, and the quiet triumph of human resilience. The final reflection centered on what had been learned. The protagonist and allies understood that courage, while important, was only one piece of the puzzle. Intelligence, patience, adaptability, humility, and human connection were equally critical. Challenges would always arise and opponents would always test limits, but the ability to learn, adjust, and support one another was what made survival and growth possible. Every mistake, disruption, and setback had contributed to this understanding, shaping a community stronger than it had ever been. Human stories continued to shine in the aftermath. Allies celebrated small achievements, shared stories of growth and resilience, and took pride in the ability to face overwhelming challenges together. The town's identity had shifted, from a group driven by ambition and courage to a community defined by adaptability, wisdom, and care. The human bonds formed through struggle became the true victory, stronger than any plan or strategy alone. The protagonist's final lesson was clear. Underestimating others or oneself could have dire consequences, but learning from mistakes and respecting the abilities of all could lead to growth beyond expectation. The opponent, though once feared, had become a teacher, highlighting the strengths and weaknesses of the town and revealing the value of patience, observation, and strategy. This understanding would remain long after the immediate challenges were over. In the end, the story concluded not with a dramatic confrontation or absolute triumph, but with reflection, understanding, and human growth. The town had survived, not because of boldness alone, but because of the lessons learned from disruption, failure, and adaptation. The protagonist had grown as a leader, allies had grown in confidence and skill, and the community had grown in unity, resilience, and wisdom. As the sun set over the town, calm returned to the streets. People moved with a quiet confidence, aware of the challenges they had faced and the lessons they had learned. The journey had been difficult, painful, and transformative. Courage, human connection, adaptability, and respect for both allies and opponents had become their guiding principles. The town had faced a powerful and patient opponent, survived disruptions and failures, and emerged wiser, stronger, and more united than ever before. The story closed with a sense of quiet triumph. No one had been completely victorious or defeated, but the lessons learned were far more valuable than any simple victory. Human resilience, patience, and connection had proven stronger than arrogance or reckless courage. The protagonist and the town now understood what it meant to face challenges wisely, adapt skillfully, and grow through adversity. The war with the wrong civilization had taught them more than they could have imagined, not only about strategy and skill, but about the depth of human strength, unity, and intelligence. And so, the tale ended not with chaos, defeat, or reckless pride, but with reflection, respect, and growth. The protagonist had led the town through trials that tested courage, wisdom, and humanity. The community had survived, strengthened by experience, guided by lessons, and bonded through shared struggle. The wrong civilization had been formidable, but the town had learned to adapt, survive, and thrive, not through brute force, but through intelligence, patience, and human resilience.